Okay. Good evening. I didn't realize today was actually a holiday for the school. So I guess this is an extra lecture. But so what I might do is, as a bonus to you guys, drop the lowest quiz for you. So that way you get some advantage of attending extra lectures, right? Okay. So today we are going to be talking about regulatory affairs and the common technical document. So I noticed in the first week, many of you mentioned to me that the thing that you were most interested in is how international regulations work, and this might answer part of that question. Because we are going to be talking about International Conference on Harmonization, okay, and we will be talking about different authorities as well. So, so far we have talked about preclinical trials, and then preclinical studies, and then clinical trials, and now we will talk about, once you have done all these studies, and while you are doing these studies, how do we interact with the authorities, right? Because after all, we are in a regulated industry, and we need to constantly interact with the authorities to make sure that we are providing them with information that satisfies everybody that the product is safe, effective, pure, etc. Right? So what are the regulators? So before we begin, I want to talk about a few things. Today's lecture, you can find most of the material in these sections, Chapter 7, 7.1 through 4, and then 7.10 through 13. Okay, so 7.1 through 4 goes over regulatory authorities, and 7.10 to 13 goes over the CTD, the Common Technical Document. Okay, and of course, one big resource for today's lecture is the ich.org website, which gives you a lot of the material that we will be covering today. Okay, and the other two websites are for FDA and European authorities. Okay, now I just want to remind everybody that the class week is from Monday, February 11th through 18th, Monday to Monday. So submissions are due at 11:59 p.m. on the last day. Again, remember, there are three things that I expect from you. One is participation in the lecture, and if you look over the archived lecture, then everybody should complete the quiz, which is kind of an indication that you have participated in the lecture. If you do attend the live lecture, you get a minimum of 8 points in that. Second thing, you want to make sure that you complete the assignment. And the material for the assignment is in the content section. And finally, you want to participate in the discussion forum. Three things important to do. Okay. And a change in the discussion forum is that I would like you to do 3 posts per week. That's the VCCD policy. So 3 posts, not 2 posts. Okay, so at least 3 posts per week. So that's a change. All right. So one thing that I wanted to mention, and the book talks about this in the 7.1, section 7.1, exhibit 7.1, they talk about the story of thalidomide. I mentioned that, I think, last time, right? Thalidomide was kind of instrumental in shaping the regulations in the U.S. If you remember, thalidomide was introduced in 1957 as a drug to treat nausea and and insomnia in pregnant women, right? And it turned out that they had never studied the effects of the drug on the babies. They studied the effect on the women, but not the babies. And well, it was horrible because it turned out that the drug could cross the placental barrier, and it affected the babies, and the babies were born with deformed extremities, and some of them were stillborn. So it was terrible, and the drug was banned in 1962. 1962, the drug was banned. But if you go to the FDA website now, you will see that the drug is approved. But the drug is approved for multiple myeloma and some other indications, including treatment of HIV positive patients. So it turns out that the drug has a lot of uses, but it's just not good for pregnant women. So it's not approved to be to treat pregnant women, but it is approved for other uses. So you can see how drugs side effects could be used in different ways, so that the drug may be terrible in one case, but it could be very useful in other cases. Okay, so just wanted to give you that tidbit about thalidomide. Okay, so let's move forward. So today we are going to first talk about what the regulatory affairs people do in a company. So there is usually, in most big pharmaceutical companies, there is a separate department called regulatory affairs. Right? Now in smaller companies, startup companies, it may be just one person doing that job, right? But in most big companies, you have a regulatory affairs department or a function. And so we'll talk about that. And then we will talk about a format-based document. So for regulatory submission. So whenever a company wants to submit an application to a regulatory authority, for example, it could be an IND, which is an investigational new drug application, biologics license application, or a new drug application, then this document, the common technical document, provides a nice format so that we can make submissions to different authorities in a consistent format, and we can pretty much know that we are submitting all the things that are required for the submission. So that's a nice thing that has been done. So the CTD is an important aspect of regulatory submissions, and we will go over that in a fair amount of detail. Okay, so now, today we are going to talk about the harmonized document, which is a common document that can be used in many countries. We will talk about more FDA-specific stuff later on. Okay, not today, but in later lectures. So today the focus is more on harmonization. Okay. All right, so let's talk about regulatory affairs. Okay, regulatory affairs in a large company is the primary communicator with regulatory authorities. They are the ones who are talking with the FDA and the EMEA and the Japanese authorities and other countries' authorities, right? And they are responsible for all submissions to and communications with all the authorities. So, so think about it. If you are in the regulatory affairs department, who do you need to be communicating with? So obviously you need to be communicating with the regulatory authorities, but you are not alone in this, because you are not in the manufacturing department, you are not in the clinical trials department, you are not in the toxicology department, but you're supposed to submit all the information that is being generated by manufacturing, by the clinical development, medical development area, the preclinical area, all the information you're supposed to be submitting to the authorities. So you are in a role where you need to be communicating with pretty much everybody, right? So when you are responsible for submission to the authorities, you need to gather information from inside the company. So you would be gathering information from manufacturing, from drug development, from toxicology, from quality. So basically, your job is communication, right? So you're communicating within the company, you're communicating outside the company, you're communicating with people in other countries. So if you're thinking of a career in regulatory affairs, you know that you need to be a good communicator, right? And a good organizer too. So it provides regulatory direction and guidance to management and project teams. So usually on every project team, there is one person at least from the regulatory affairs department, and they are usually providing guidance on, oh, the FDA needs this information, oh, the EMEA needs a different type of validation, things like that. They will be giving guidance to all the different people within the company. And not, you know, in the past, when I was working at Amgen, the regulatory affairs department, one person from that will actually guide the inspectors through facilities during inspections. But nowadays, that's not their role. But you know, small companies, that still might be the case. Okay, so that's the role of the regulatory affairs department. They are always trying to solve issues, problems, and they are also developing strategic plans for submissions to the authorities. So it's not just, okay, let's put together something. They, you know, when a product gets discovered and starts development, regulatory affairs starts to think, how do we want to make this submission? Do we want to submit to Europe first or in the US first? What's the best way to do this? So there is a lot of strategy involved in regulatory submission, because you might be able to get approval in Europe much faster than in US sometimes, depending on the product. So there are, you know, for example, medical devices, it is easier to get submissions in Europe than in the US. So depending on the product, you might develop different strategies. So they are involved in strategic plans. And they also, you know, you will be also talking with other company regulatory people to kind of bounce ideas off of them and get advice on how to handle different situations. So what I'm trying to get across is this is primarily a very communication intensive job, right? And function. Okay. So in clinical trials, regulatory affairs are going to provide input into the clinical trial program, what the expectations of the authorities are. They will be preparing submissions like the IND. The IND stands for Investigational New Drug Application to international regulatory agencies. So what happens is when the time comes for submission, one person from the regulatory affairs department kind of sets up a whole document format, right? So, and we're going to be looking at the document format later on, but essentially that person is going to set up the table of contents. Okay, so table of contents, and then he or she is going to assign different people to fill in the information. So for example, they will assign somebody from manufacturing to fill in the information for the CMC section, right? Manufacturing or quality. And then somebody from drug development to fill in the section for for the clinical trial results, etc. Okay, so essentially they will be kind of directing the preparation of the submissions, that go to the authorities. And then they plan and, okay, so that's the role in clinical trials. And in preparation for application of marketing approval, again, plan the documentation content. So in this case, it could be the BLA or the NDA. Everybody remember these acronyms? You should become familiar with these acronyms, right? BLA stands for, anybody? Very good. Biologics License Application. That's PAT. Application, and the NDA is New Drug Application, right? Okay. All right. So, and then prepare proposed labeling. Remember how important labeling is? We talked about that a couple of weeks ago, right? So regulatory affairs plays a role in that as well. Okay. So we said that these guys are going to be interacting with the authorities. So who are the authorities? In Europe, we have the EMEA, the European Medicines Agency, and there are separate national authorities so there are country-specific authorities as well. It can get pretty messy in Europe. Okay, and of course we know that in the USA it's the Food and Drug Administration. In Japan it's the Pharmaceutical and Medical Devices Agency. And there are other countries, for example, Health Canada, China's State Food and Drug Administration. The book gives you a fair amount of detail in sections 7.2 through 7.9. Okay, for example, table 7.2 lists all many country authorities. For example, India's Central Drug Standard Control Organization, and Australia's Therapeutic Goods Administration, and in Mexico it's the Ministry of Health, etc. So there's a lot of detail in the book. We are mostly concerned with Europe, US, and Japan because most of the biggest market is in these places right now. Of course, in China and India now the markets are growing very fast. Okay, so if you work in a manufacturing plant, you may be inspected by any of these authorities, right? If your company is marketing a product in a particular country, that country's authority has the authority to come and inspect your plant, right? So the more countries you market to, the more inspections you can get. And they are not fun, but necessary, right? And in Europe, you can follow three different procedures to apply to the authorities. There is one procedure called the centralized procedure. And if you are applying for a biologic, then this is mandatory. So centralized procedure is mandatory for biologics. And then there is another procedure called mutual recognition procedure. Mutual recognition procedure. So this one, the way it works is that you can apply to one country, and if that country has an agreement with other countries, a mutual recognition agreement with other countries, then you can use the same information and your authorization to apply to other countries that have that mutual recognition agreement. Okay, so that's the second procedure, and then there is the decentralized procedure. So you go to the individual countries. So there are different procedures. Okay. By the way, the EMEA Committee for Drug Approval is called CHIMP. So the committee there is called Committee for Medicinal Products for Human Use, CHMP. Okay. Now, the centralized procedure applies to approval submissions. The clinical trial applications are not centralized in Europe. Okay. All right, let's move forward. So a little bit more about the US FDA. US FDA is divided into these different parts. First, there is the CDER, Center for Drugs Evaluation and Research, and then there is the CBER, the Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research, and then there is Center for Devices and Radiological Health, CDRH, Veterinary Medicine, and Office of Regulatory Affairs. This is the one that would be going, this is a common one that covers everything. Okay, so now we in the biotech industry are mostly involved with these two, CDER and CBER. Unless you are using some kind of a device with your drug product. Can you give me an example of where you might use a device with a drug product? Okay, injection. So you're talking about syringe, right? Well, syringe, I'm not sure if that's a delivery device, but I'm talking about something that you would use with people, that stays with the person. So you might have heard of insulin pumps that are implanted. Have you heard of insulin pumps that are implanted? So that is a device, isn't it? That's a medical device that is implanted into a person. And so here is a combination of a drug and a device. The insulin is the drug and pump is the device, and so that can also come under the device category. Okay. So now, in the past, in the 1990s, biotech companies mostly dealt with CBER because all the protein products were supposed to be biologics. Now, more recently, what has happened is most of the protein products have come under the purview of CDER. Okay, and so the book will tell you. So the CBER still is in charge of some products, but their authority has been significantly diminished. And you can look in the book for which areas CBER is involved in. For example, blood plasma, etc. But most of the protein products are now evaluated by CDER. Okay, and in the past we used to apply to CBER, and we used to have two different applications. We used to have Establishment License Application, ELA, and a Product License Application, PLA, right? So these two have now been combined into one application, which is the Biologics License Application, the BLA, right? And most of the time we are sending the BLA to CDER. Okay? And so the Biologics License Application applies to most of the protein drugs, but we don't send it to the Biologics Evaluation and Research Center. We send it to the Drug Evaluation and Research Center, right? And if you send a drug application, like a small molecule drug, then we send an NDA, not a BLA, a new drug application, to CDER. Have I confused you enough yet? Yeah, it is pretty confusing. So it is the kind of the way things have evolved. You know, in the beginning, biologics, all proteins were supposed to be biologics, and they were sent here. But then we started sending them to the CEDAR. And by the way, most of the proteins require a BLA, but insulin is not considered a biologic. Insulin is you require an NDA. Insulin they sent with an NDA, right? So anyway, this is just kind of a big picture thing for you. The book gives you more details about what is covered in what. Okay, uh, just kind of a broad categorization of what you do with submissions. Okay, so the more interesting thing is that people finally recognized that there are so many countries and we have to apply to all these countries. And wouldn't it be nice if there was just one application that we could send to all the countries, right? So this ICH, the International Conference on Harmonization, do you want to know the full name for ICH? It is the International Conference on Harmonization of Technical Requirements for Registration of Pharmaceuticals for Human Use. That's what the full form is for ICH. Anyway, we will shorten it to ICH. And do you know what WHO is? WHO is World Health Organization. Yeah, World Health Organization. And it is not a regulatory body, but it is an organization that is concerned about health issues in the whole world. And they had a conference in 1989. And during that conference, the seeds for ICH were planted because people started to say we need some common way of communicating with everybody, right? So ICH was then formed in 1990, and the aim is to, of course, form a joint regulatory industry initiative on harmonization for drug regulation. And it's composed of representatives from both regulatory agencies, industry associations, and in USA, Europe, and Japan. So they have meetings every year. They go from one area to the other. They rotate, right? And so they are constantly updating their documents and their guidances and their requirements. But this is a good thing, right? So ICH, if you go to the, I have posted, if you go to the ICH I forget if it is .com or .org, ich.org. If you go to that website, I posted it. I showed it to you earlier, right? If you go to that website, it will show you that the guidelines fall under four main categories. So you should remember the categories that ICH has. So an easy way to remember that is QSEM, right? QSEM, the four categories: quality, safety, efficacy, and then multidisciplinary. So quality, of course, we know we are dealing with quality of products, GMPs, clinical development, pharmaceutical development, risk management, etc. Safety has to do with toxicology testing and safety studies in humans. and efficacy, of course, is it effective or not? And then there is multidisciplinary. Multidisciplinary applies to any of these, so two or more of these categories. So because they couldn't classify it in one, they have multidisciplinary. And so in the multidisciplinary category, there is the M4, which is the home of the common technical document, okay, which is what we're going to be talking about a lot today. Yeah. So so M4 in the ICH. So you should know the QSEM categories, and you should know that the common technical document is housed in M4 section of the multidisciplinary. Okay. All right. So let's move forward. Okay. So now we come to the common technical document. Okay. So it has many sections, of course, the common technical document. When you are providing a submission to the authorities, you are required to provide lots and lots of information. So what the CTD does is it organizes the data in a nice format so that you are better able to organize and know what to submit. And now it is harmonized and it is used in the US, EU, Nordic countries, Australia, Canada, and Japan. Okay, and it's divided into 5 main sections: the general, which is organization; quality; module 3, safety, efficacy, and clinical study reports. Okay, and so don't confuse these sections. There are 4 sections. There is organization, quality, safety, and efficacy. And then they are divided into 5 modules. So we are going to see that next, okay? So it provides submission guidelines, preparation of drug submission in a specific configuration, format requirements, information requirements. Those are all listed there. So when you prepare the document, by the way, when you prepare the document, your CMC section, the chemistry, manufacturing, and control section, goes in the quality portion. Okay, so this is kind of a nice visual, and the book has this diagram for you. So remember, there are these modules. Module 1, right here. I should change the color. So module 1 is right here. And then there is module 2, which has several sections, right? Module 2, because it has some common sections to the base of the pyramid: quality, module 3, non-clinical study reports, module 4, and clinical study reports, module 5. Okay, so module 1, of course, it has general information. So module 1 is going to have regional administrative information, table of contents for module 1, and overall table of contents. And then 2.1 is again general information. 2.2 is general information. 2.3 is going to be quality specific. 2.4, 2.6 are non-clinical studies specific. 2.5, 2.7 are clinical study report specific, but mostly general information about that. And then more specific information would be in these modules. So do we get the structure of the document, how it is organized? Okay. So Module 1, administrative, sets regulatory and legal framework. So it has the table of contents for Module 1. This is not part of the formal CTD, okay? Because the CTD has more specific information. Okay, so Module 2 is the overall summary. Overall summary of all the three things, right? Quality, non-clinical, and clinical. Now, you notice that here we are talking about non-clinical. And that's the same as preclinical. So non-clinical is the same as preclinical. So what would that include? That would include the toxicology studies in animals and other preclinical studies, right? So remember, non-clinical is the same as preclinical. Okay, so begins with a general introduction to the product, what class it is, like is it antihypertensive, what mode of action, is it some kind of enzyme inhibitor, and proposed clinical use. And there is a one-page limit to it. So there are 7 sections in the following order. You have table of contents, introduction, quality overall summary. So remember the 3 things: overview of non-clinical and clinical overview, the 3 things. And then you have non-clinical written and tabulated summaries and clinical summary. Okay. So these are the sections. So remember, in the pyramid, you had the 1 over here and then 2. Well, there was the common area here and more specific to overall summaries over here, right? So if you remember that structure, it might be easier to understand CTD. Okay, there it is. All right, so now we are going to, so we were talking about Module 2. Now we will talk about Module 3, right? Oh, no, we are still talking about Module 2.4, non-clinical overview. So provides integrated overall, you can read this, analysis of the information in the CTD. So the keywords are integrated overall analysis. Okay, so you're not giving specifics here. So remember that in the document, this section was specific to quality. These sections were specific to non-clinical, and 2.5, 2.7 are more specific to clinical studies, right? So here is an example of efficacy of the clinic. When you did clinical studies, you can talk about efficacy here. And again, it's an overall summary. So efficacy, the purpose is critical analysis of clinical data pertinent to efficacy of the product, and it considers all the relevant data and provides a overall summary of what your findings were, and also notes prematurely terminated studies and their impact. Okay, so you basically summarize what you have done with respect to efficacy. And 2.6, non-clinical written. These are just examples. I'm giving you examples of different sections, right? So Module 2.6, remember, it was in the middle section. So it was about non-clinical studies. So it's written and tabulated summaries of non-clinical studies. And again, the keyword here is summaries, right? Okay, so now let's get to Module 3, which is more of a concern to us because we are focusing on the operations side of the drug development process, right? And so You should remember that Module 3 is the home of the CMC section. And remember what CMC stands for: chemistry, manufacturing, and controls. Chemistry, manufacturing, and controls. So this is where, and this is an example. I don't expect you to remember all these, sub-parts of this. Just remember that we are providing information on CMC here, right? So you talk about, you have the, of course, table of content, and then you have what the drug substance is, how you manufacture it, how you characterize it, and the quality aspects of it, what are the reference standard material. So for example, whenever you have a drug product, you have to create a reference standard against which you compare all your manufacturing samples, right? So reference standard, where is it kept and how is it kept? Container closure system, then the drug product is the finished pharmaceutical product, the vial or the syringe that you're producing, right? And these are sections related to the vial. This is the drug substance. This is the what we call bulk. This is the bulk product, and this is the vial product, right? And there are appendices. So I don't expect you to remember all of this. This is just for your information, but you should remember that Module 3 is the home of quality, which is the home of the CMC section, which is important to us. Okay, so we just talked about this guy here, and then we will talk about these. So preclinical or non-clinical study reports goes into Module 4. So now here you have more details of the study report. But if you are applying for an NDA, at this point, details of animal studies are not important because you have already applied to the FDA for starting your clinical trials, right? So they have already reviewed the details of your animal studies. So here, we are only providing summary reports. So summary reports. So you don't have to provide individual animal data, right? Okay. So that's Module 4. So what are the goals of non-clinical at the IND stage? At the IND stage, when you are applying for clinical trials, you want to try to identify the starting dose. You want to identify organ toxicities and guide dosing regimens. So when you provide information on your preclinical, non-clinical studies, you should be addressing these issues. And so the study design has to cover those things. You want to know what kind of safety and start dose you are going to be using in the humans. So they should mimic the schedule. The toxicology study should mimic the schedule, duration, formulation, and route for the clinical trials so that you get relevant data. You should conform to GLPs, of course, and standard toxicology protocols. Initial IND development. These are all parts of your non-clinical format. Remember the Module 4. So, this is all standard data. I don't expect you to remember details of this, just for your information. Okay. And then IND and NDA stage, you want long-term tox studies. Genetic tox panel has to be completed. Reproductive toxicology, carcinogenicity studies, and pharmacogenomic data. What do we mean by pharmacogenomic data? So it's the interaction of the drugs with the genes. So it's interaction of the drugs with the genes. So that's what Module 4 is all about. And Module 5, now we get into human clinical studies, right? Clinical studies. So again, here is the standard. So as you can see, every section, they give you guidance on what is expected, right? What is expected. So once you have this format, it becomes easy to fill in the things, right? You reports on post-marketing experience, report of efficacy and safety studies, biopharmaceutic studies, etc., etc. So you are, basically it's the whole CTD is providing you guidance on organizing your submission for your BLA or NDA, right? It's focused on clinical information, any new protocols, protocol amendments, IND safety report, etc., etc. Okay, so the common technical document format is now available, right? It was developed, I think around 2000, and you could use it as of July 1st, 2001. Not mandatory, but after July 1st, 2003, it became mandatory. So now you must use it, this format, okay? Which is a good thing. Now everybody submits in the same format, right? So this format is used regardless of previous submissions. So now you must use this format, and it is intended to last the entire life of the product. That means, you're always, even whether it is IND or NDA or post-marketing surveillance, you always use the same format. And now you can also submit in electronic format, right? So applies to new drug applications. It applies to abbreviated new drug applications. It applies to supplements to the abbreviated new drug applications. How many acronyms have I given you so far? Abbreviated NDA, supplement. 50 is a nice number. Okay. So, and also notifiable changes. It also applies to notifiable changes. What do we mean by that? Notifiable changes. So whenever you make changes to the CMC section, whenever we make changes to the CMC section, we need to notify the authorities. Okay. Now, when FDA reviews the CTD, there are all kinds of people involved. You have project managers, medical officers, pharmacologists, toxicologists, chemists, pharmacokineticists, statisticians, because there are so many sections of the NDA, right? Okay, so this is what I was talking about. If you change the CMC, now can you give me examples of why you might change the CMC section? Remember, CMC section stands for chemistry, manufacturing, and controls. So can you give me examples of when you might need to change the CMC? One example is, we used to, when I say we, I used to work at Amgen. So at Amgen, we used to manufacture, Victoria says changing manufacturing equipment. Of course, yeah, if you change the equipment, so let's say that you used to manufacture Epogen in roller bottles. So they used to manufacture Epogen in roller bottles, and after some time they decided that that was too inefficient, and so they should go to bioreactors, right? And so that's a significant change, right? And so you need to make changes. So you had told the FDA that you are manufacturing Epogen in roller bottles, and now you want to change to bioreactors. So you better notify the authorities. Another example is we used to manufacture the product in Thousand Oaks, and now it is being manufactured in Puerto Rico. Well, we have a new facility and new equipment, so we better notify the authorities, right? So anytime you make a change to any part of the CMC, you need to notify the authorities. Now, how do you notify the authorities? Well, there are many ways to do that. Okay, so first is annual report. You should submit an annual report to your BLA and NDA, right? So in the annual report, you might tell them that everything is under control. No, there are no changes to report, and that we have been monitoring the bioburden. It's the same product. There have been no product returns, or the product returns are under control, things like that. Okay. Now, on the other hand, you might have made some changes that are not that important to to the FDA. So these are minor changes, and you can implement. So this kind of change is called CBE 0. CBE 0. That means you don't require any approval from the FDA for this. That means you can implement it on day 0, right? Implement it on day 0. Implement immediately. So for example, you change the in-process control limits. Okay, so you already have specifications. So for example, the specification might be from this limit to this limit. Okay, and this could be a specification, for example, for your cell count. Okay, but normally, so this is what you have told the FDA, that we will make sure that the cell counts are within these two limits. But for your day-to-day operation, you want to be more conservative, and these are your in-process control limits. So you want to make sure that the cell count is within these two limits, even though you have told the FDA these are the action limits, right? So you might change the limits to accommodate a little higher range, and that's okay because you have validated your process to the higher limits. Am I making sense? So these are minor changes. You are not affecting anything that you have told the FDA. Okay, and so those things you can change without prior notification. You do tell the FDA that you have done that, but you don't need approval from them. Okay. Now, CBE 30 is a major change. Okay, so now you need to let the FDA know, and you need to wait for 30 days before you implement it. So you file this under the CBE 30 category. Okay, and for example, if there are out of specification limits and you are changing them, okay, this is a change to the specification, right? or you have new equipment, but it is similar equipment. So here you might want to notify the FDA that we are changing the bioreactor. It's similar, but it's a new equipment. Can we proceed? And most of the time, the FDA will not respond if they don't care. So they won't respond. So you wait for 30 days, and then you can make the change. Okay. And then the third category, which is the most significant, is prior approval supplement. Prior approval supplement. So PAS is prior. Another acronym for you. You guys will be dreaming about these acronyms tonight, right? Okay, so significant change with potential impact or on product properties. Significant change with potential impact on product properties. I'll give you an example of how important this is. You guys know a company called Genentech? Well, it turned out that their first mammalian cell product is called TPA, tissue plasminogen activator. Brand name is Activase, right? Well, when they were applying for approval for this product, this was back in, I think it was late 80s. They were applying for approval for TPA, and what they did was when they did their clinical trials, they used roller bottles. Okay, and when they started manufacturing the product, they went to a bioreactor. And guess what? When they did that, the properties of the protein changed a little bit. The glycosylation of the protein changed a little bit. And so the molecule was not identical. And the FDA noticed that, and they did not approve the product. They said, we need more studies from you to show that the two products are similar, the two products do not affect the pharmacology or the pharmacodynamic, PK or PD, right? So this was a major thing. Their approval was delayed by more than 6 months. Can you imagine how much money they lost and what happened to their stock price? So if there is a change that involves impact on product properties, you better wait for the FDA, right, to approve it. So that's called prior approval supplement. They require FDA approval prior to implementation. So if we change, for example, change the commercial facility. So when Amgen went from Thousand Oaks to Puerto Rico, they had to wait for the FDA to come and inspect the new facility and approve it, and then they could change over. So that would be a PAS. Okay. So are we clear on the differences between CBE0, CBE30, and PAS? So whenever we are making changes to the CMC, you have to notify the authorities. Some of them minor, some of them major. Okay, so in summary, the CTD is a guidance describing harmonized format for technical documentation for registration in all the 3 regions. What are the 3 regions? USA, Europe, and Japan. Okay. Modules 2 to 5 are common to all regions, reduces the time and resources used to compile registration documentation. So instead of doing 3 submissions, you're doing 1. You're preparing 1 document. You're doing 3 submissions, but you're preparing 1 document. um, you can use with other ICH guidance, and allows for regional specific summaries. So this is the nice thing about CTDs, right? Okay, so um, this week's class exercise, I'm asking you to go to the ICH document, the website, and you're going to the primary source. So look for one particular document there. The instruction I provided, the instructions, basically you are supposed to go to the ICH website and do something. Okay, so that is the end of the lecture. I want to make sure that, I gave you lots of acronyms and lots of details. I don't expect you to remember all of that. So I just want to reiterate what I expect you to remember, right? So I expect you to remember the roles of the regulatory affair, right? Roles of regulatory affairs department. I expect you to remember what is the aim. What is the aim of the ICH? Okay. I expect you to remember the 4 major categories of ICH. Does anybody remember that? QSEM? Yeah, QSEM, quality, safety, efficacy, and multidisciplinary, right? Okay, good, good. I'm glad some of you remember. Okay, and I want you to remember that M4 under the multidisciplinary category is the location of the CTD, right? So this is the out of the QSEM, quality, safety, efficacy, and multidisciplinary. M4 is in the multidisciplinary, and that's where the location of the CTD is, right? And Module 3, I want you to remember that Module 3 in CTD is the CMC section, right? So I want you to know where the CMC section is. Okay. Now I want you to remember the names of the modules, not the details of the modules, but modules 2, 4, and 5, right? And of course 3 is quality. Module 3 is quality. So 4 and 5, remember non-clinical and clinical, etc. And then know that when you make changes to CMC, that you have to notify the authority, and need you to remember the 3 categories of changes. Okay, so those are the important things to remember. The rest is for your reading pleasure, and you can dream about them at night. Okay, so what questions do you have? Wow, no questions, huh? I am good. Or you're asleep, which is the case. Okay, good. All right, so that's it then. So we have a lecture next week, Tuesday, and remember to do the 3 things: quiz, class exercise, assignment, and the last thing is participation. Okay. So see you next week. Have a good weekend. You're welcome.